Okay, the title of this is Prisons Part 1. I subtitle it One of America's Few Growth Industries. Unfortunately, that's true. But the basic idea here is I just say that mainly because it costs a whole lot of money, by the way. Um, and I do think we overuse it, but it is a valuable resource. I want to be very clear about that. There is a place for prison and jail, and I do want certain people incarcerated. Um, but I will explain a little bit about the backgrounds of prisons, the types of prisons we have, federal and state, etc. All right, so first of all, before I became a criminology professor, I did not know the difference between jail and prison. I would use those interchangeably. They are not the same thing. Don't get them mixed up. Okay, jail is on Oahu. It's called HCC. I think that's Honolulu Correctional Community. I don't know what it is called. It's the one over there by the airport. Um, you were there for two reasons. About half the people, I'm going to simplify this, okay? So please don't get too crazy on this here. So, but basically, half the people in jail are sitting there awaiting trial because they were not offered bail. Bail means that if you're offered bail, it's a monetary amount you put down and you agree to show up once your trial starts. And the money is supposed to keep you from leaving. There used to be a show, I don't know if it still goes on, it's called Dog the Bounty Hunter, excuse my yawn. It was set here on Oahu. I heard that my closest neighbor, it was filmed there. He had ran a little crack house here in Makaha Valley. Um, so that would be people didn't put down, he put down the money for them. Basically, you put down, there's why bail is very profitable. Basically, let's pretend it was $100 bail. It's not usually that, okay? It's much, much more. But you give Dog the Bounty Hunter 10% of that, and if you show up, he keeps your 10%. So if you say $100,000 bail, he gets to keep 10 grand. And that's why he would go chase you down and could legally hook you up in handcuffs because he wanted his, if you didn't show up, he was on the hook for 100 grand. Okay. One of my classmates in high school was, according to my friend, the richest Hispanic in California, which is saying something. I don't know if that's true or not, but I know they were very, very wealthy. And he ran a series of bails bonds shops around California and the West. California did pass a law to get rid of cash bail, which I think is good because you shouldn't be held in jail awaiting trial based upon your ability to pay. In my opinion, it should be based upon how dangerous you are to the society. Um, the other half of people in jail are there for non-felony sentences of less than a year. Um, I have heard, this is just, I don't know if this is true or not, but at one point I had heard that due to overcrowding in Halava, which is our main prison on Oahu and the biggest prison, or the most serious prison in the state, in Halava Valley, they were housing some people in HCC, which is our jail, for more than a year. But in general, you're in jail if you're sentenced, right? You're convicted and sentenced. You're usually sentenced to something less than a year, non-felony, and that's why you're in jail. Prison is the opposite. You are sent to prison only for felonies. These are more serious crimes, and they generally have sentences of more than a year. You may have had to fill out a job application where they ask if you're a felon. Okay, in some states, they deny you the right to vote forever if you're a felon. That is starting to change. The whole idea, even after you paid even after you paid your dues to society, if you know what I mean. Once you paid your dues to society, in my opinion, you should be allowed to vote. Um, but that's just my opinion. Okay, I'll tell you a little bit. I don't want to bore you with history, but I want to provide you a little bit of the history because we need to always, it's a really expensive resource, okay? Um, State of Hawaii doesn't release a lot of data, okay, on this. When I first became a professor, I called them up, tried to get data from them. They're like, oh, yeah, yeah, we'll get back to you. Well, guess what? 20 years later, I'm still waiting. Um, but the newspaper had a story on it, and they were spending about 20,000 per person per year to send people off to a private prison in Arizona. About half of our prisoners were there, and about 40,000 here in Hawaii, and about half of our prisoners were here. That's why they were sending people to Arizona, because it was half the price. We're spending something like $300 million a year in 2006 dollars locking up people. It was a lot. Um, so that's an expensive resource. We should sort of have a reason. We don't want to send everybody to prison because it's so darn expensive. What's our reason? So that's why I'm giving you the historical context. And so it's important to realize that just the way we do things now, that doesn't mean we have to do things in the future, right? There may be better ways, and a smart society changes the way they do things. When you look at the facts, and there are facts now, unfortunately now people are trying to say that things that they disagree with are fake news or fake facts. That's BS. There are facts in the world, and so when the facts present themselves and they change, we should change our mind, okay, in terms of how we have public policy, because public policy are our tax dollars, and I believe they should be spent wisely, and I think everybody would agree with that, unless you're a weirdo. Everybody agrees that we want our tax dollars spent wisely. Okay, so remember, things haven't always been as they are now. Okay, so it allows us, when we think about what we should do, don't limit yourself to just things how we're doing it now. Okay, so it's kind of interesting. The goal of the first modern prison was actually, I think it was like the 1800s somewhere in Pennsylvania, and it was prior to that they'd been really really nasty places, and I think there's a lot of Quakers, and I think it was the Quakers that brought it about. They're a very humanistic religion, sort of focus on the love all people, forgive people kind of a thing. Um, it was really designed where how can we get them to change their ways? And the idea was that by treating them really horribly, that's not going to get them to change their ways. And so the first prisons were we the they sort of put people. The idea is let's get away from revenge, right? And we'll go towards more of a rehabilitation. Okay, so you got to kind of remember this is sort of the same historical proximity, at least, of public beatings, right, as a way to treat criminals, public hangings, etc., right? And so these people sort of came along and they say, we're also sort of changing from a rural economy to an industrialized economy where you have more and more people in cities, right? So crime becomes more visible, right? So that sort of also drives, like when you start seeing crime on the streets and whatnot. Um, the key here is that the guiding principle behind it was the philosophy of rehabilitation. How do we get people to change their ways? Okay, it's out of compassion. It's to treat people humanely. Okay, and the idea was that they were to be in this sort of rather stark environment. So you weren't coddled, but you also weren't, you were given adequate food, clothing, etc. And you like had a Bible, and you're supposed to reflect on what you had done. And it was only by this period of reflection and studying the Bible, etc., that you will learn your evil ways and sort of become reborn and decide that when you get out, um, I'm going to change my ways. So it was a deeply compassionate reason. Okay. Um, they're visited by clergy, etc. And so the question posed, right, is, well, we know that treating them really harshly wouldn't work. So what if we put them, isolate them from society, encourage them to reflect upon themselves? Will that get, in a religious sort of reawakening way, will that get them to change their ways? And when they come out, will they be less, decide that, the light of God is coming into their lives and they're no longer going to be a criminal? So in a way, you're sort of trying to reconfigure their moral compass. Now, while it started that way, it's fair to say that over time, remember, things aren't always the same and they change over time. That's no longer um, the case in the United States, especially starting in 1980s. There was a heyday of rehabilitation in sort of the 60s and 70s, but in the 1980s, there was a dramatic shift towards conservative politics in the United States. And part of that was, well, we've been coddling these people, and the real reason is they're horrible people, and we're either going to punish them, and or the only way they're going to learn their lesson is if we treat them harshly. And so they got, they started putting people away for longer periods of time, getting rid of rehabilitation, and so clearly we've gone to more of a punishment model, as you'll see later. Okay, starting in the 1980s. You'd be remiss. Take a look at this picture. This is called the Panopticon. It's sort of an architectural marvel. Okay, so that's the guard tower in the middle, and it's all of the cells go around it in a circle, so the guard can see into every single cell. And the idea was that would allow the guard to make sure that they were being good and reflecting upon themselves, and that they weren't doing naughty things. So it's kind of cool, right? It's like an architectural expression of, we're going to get you to reform and change your ways, and maybe you won't change your ways just with quiet reflection of God, but if we oversee you and make sure you're doing so, maybe you will. So it's just kind of cool. All right. I'm going to give you some conceptual models to think about how we organize prison. They can overlap. I don't want you to think that they don't. But they sort of ask you, like, what is the goal of your prison system, if you will? Okay, it's sort of the goals of sentencing. And when we use prison, what are we seeking to the prison to accomplish for us? Okay, so again, don't think of these as either or, but they can be overlapping, and just in certain periods of time, one might be a more dominant philosophy at the time. Okay? So the custodial model, that emphasizes incapacitation. That's the inability to commit a crime if you're locked up. Deterrence, the idea is that if you're locked up, you'll learn your lesson and you'll be deterred to committing future crimes. And perhaps even retribution, which is, if you do something serious, or something serious should be done to you, and being locked up is pretty serious. And some might even offer the emotional side of it, of revenge, right? But the idea behind the custodial model is there's very strict discipline and security, and it's sort of, there's a sense of authority and power in the sense of the staff and the warden. As I say in the lecture notes, sort of like lock them up and throw away the key. Okay, all aspects of inmate life are highly controlled and highly regulated. And I say it was popular prior to World War II, and it was the primary model used in most maximum security prisons, and I would say for good reason. You may have heard of a Supermax facility. They had one in my home state of California called Pelican Bay. That was a reserve for the people who not only in prison, but they really break the rules quite a bit, so much that they're endangering others to a huge extent. But it's fair to say that as our prisons grew in the 1980s, we got in that get tough on crime period, the custodial model became more and more popular. And as opposed to the rehabilitation model, that's just what it sounds like. The idea is that you're going to get people, while you have them in prison, you're going to offer them certain services so they can rehabilitate themselves. It's based upon the theory that a human being has they're not just animals, they're not evil people. They're just, good people, and they need sort of maybe some life skills. It could be education, it could be job training, it could be drug treatment. It can be all of those. It could even be religious, if you will. And the idea is that you're going to create an environment where they will, while in prison, change themselves. The key to this is that the heyday of this was in the 60s and 70s. So you have professional staffs, you have professional vocational counselors, right? You have professional educators, you have professional drug treatment people, professional psychiatrists, etc. Okay, who might offer these various programs, such as counseling, therapy, etc. The reintegration model also saw its heyday in the 60s and 70s, and it seeked that the idea was that, look, you don't want to separate them from the community because we're going to send them back to the community. About 95% of the people in prison eventually get out. So if we want them to know how to act in the community, we need to keep them connected to the community. And I would say that it's not unreasonable. This is not an unreasonable opinion. When you put people, at least now, prisons are a really harsh environment, and you're around people who aren't nice, to put it very mildly. Huge amounts of violence, pressure. It's a psychologically damaging place, without a doubt. Even if you run stuff, the idea would be, oh, these guys who run stuff, they've got it great. No, they don't. They're constantly worried about somebody coming and killing them and taking over their cigarette trade or whatever. And they're all damaged. And we're going to let 95% of them out one day. So we want them to know how to act once they get out. And the fact here's my opinion, is that if you stay there too long, eventually, if you stay there for 20 years, so damage, a lot of people don't know how to act when they get out. It's very similar to the trauma created by combat, right? You could say, well, hey, most folks who go to, I don't know what the percentage are for post-traumatic stress disorder in combat, but it's a very natural, is that some people, when they get back into the world, they're so traumatized by combat, they have a hard time acting, reintegrating into the normal world. So, it's not unreasonable to say that prison doesn't do the same thing. In fact, I would say it's probably a fact that it does for a lot of folk. Okay? So it's the idea that strong ties to community, family, church, a job, etc. Are good. And the more you can keep those ties, the more likely once you get out, you're going to maintain that. Okay? Again, it started to give way to the custodial model around 1980 as well. And I would say since 1980, and especially as we've suffered prison overcrowding, prison overcrowding, the custodial model has been the dominant model, although there's some rehabilitation, but not as much. And it's become more and more necessary when you have overcrowding. Okay, there are two prison systems in the United States, federal and state. Okay, the vast majority of people sitting in prison are there for a state crime, and they're sitting in state prisons. Each of the 50 states have their own set of criminal laws and their own set of punishments. So you could be convicted of the same crime in different states. One might send you to prison, one might not. They might both send you to prison. One might send you longer than the other. Okay? I shouldn't say all, but the vast majority of what we call street crimes, the ones you imagine in your head, robbery, rape, murder, stealing a car, are state crimes. Okay? And so you would end up in a state prison. Okay. There's one exception to this I've heard. I'm not sure. If any federal cops are out there, I'd like to know, what if you get popped committing a crime like on a military base? Do you go to the state prison? What about a national park? Do you go to a state prison? How does that work? I'm not sure about that. Okay, so I'm not going to get into that. But if somebody knows, could you let me know? All right. Federal crimes are small. Okay, the way the Constitution was set up, there were 13 colonies, and they all had their own functioning criminal justice systems, right? And so the idea was that state rights were important. The main one that people in the South want to protect was slavery, of course. But the idea would be the states can deal with most of the crimes, and the federal government will only get involved in crimes that where the federal government has a vested interest, like treason or crime across international borders, right? I don't know if there was smuggling across international borders back in the day, right? But that would be a federal crime now. Disputes between states. If you commit a crime and you transport people or that crime across state borders, you can might be a federal crime. Okay, but starting in the 1980s, um, drugs became seen as a huge, huge social problem, and our federal legislators, meaning your senators and U.S. representatives, passed a whole slew of duplicate drug crimes. So, depending on, they were designed to only catch the drug kingpins, but that wasn't the case in many instances. But you sort of had double jeopardy. Um, it sort of leads this. I just want to real quickly mention this idea of federalism. So there's something in the Constitution called the Supremacy Clause. Um, and the idea there is that when there's a dispute, federal law trumps or supersedes state law. Okay. Um, so, for example, when they were first passed, if you had 5 grams of crack cocaine, you were eligible for federal drug penalty. If you were caught dealing any drug within something like 200 meters, 200 yards, I don't know the exact distance, of a schoolyard, you were eligible for a federal drug penalty. If you look, if I ask you to watch the Prisoners Part 2 series, I go into much greater detail and show how um, the federal system, especially, has been dramatically altered by the war on drugs. And you'll see that when you look at the data, that as proportional growth, meaning from where they started, the federal system grew at a much higher rate since 1980, primarily due to nonviolent drug offenses. Okay, so you can read the lecture notes to get a little bit more of that. So this, just to give you remember I said the vast majority of people in prison in the U.S. are in a state prison. Just to give you an example, this has remained remarkably consistent over the war on drugs. In 1980, we saw a huge growth, but this has remained pretty consistent. So about 88% of everybody in prison is in a state prison, and about 12 are in the federal prison system. If you see Prisons Part 2A lecture, I will show you the dramatic growth in the federal prisons due to the war on drugs. They all grew, both state and federal, but federal prison system grew much, much, much more dramatically on the basis of where it started, and that was primarily fueled by the war on drugs. Just so you know, somewhere around the sort of 2005 to 2010, the federal government started becoming inconsistent with how they report their data. They were started combining populations and whatnot, which isn't real helpful. So when I gave you these percentages, it's the most recent data available using the Bureau of Justice Statistics, but apparently some of the states are including jail inmates in there. But just to give you a feeling, okay, of the size. Okay, state prisons are organized in usually under a Department of Corrections, if you will. It's typically under the executive branch. Hawaii calls ours the Department of Public Safety, and it is under the executive branch. You have sort of, let me explain some, that's just the title there of our Department of Public Safety, the Director of Public Safety. That would just be the person who administers them. Wardens run a prison. As you may have, if you've seen a movie, I'm sure you've seen that. That's sort of the top dog in the prison. Um, and then typically you have various staff in the prison. Okay, so obviously you have prison guards, oftentimes correctional officers is their official title. But you'll have accountants, administrators. You have line staff that are related to prisoner life, such as obviously you have people who cook or at least oversee it, educators, and those various people that you see there. Okay, so remember there's various folks in these prisons. And typically this is the situation you see in a state, but not always. Okay, the Federal Bureau of Prisons was created in the 1930s. I'm thinking that's the gangster times. You may have heard of Al Capone and Alcatraz, that cool island off San Francisco and Oakland. That is a federal prison, or was. At the time, there were only 11 of these. Okay, and you can see the security levels there. As of April 2002, there are 102. You don't need to understand. I'm not going to ever test you on that, but that was just to give people an idea of what's going on. Don't worry about that. So basically, all I want you to know is that there are state prison systems and federal prison systems. They are subject to different laws, right? There are federal laws. If you violate a federal criminal law, most likely a drug law, but it could be weapons, taxes, etc., you would go to a federal prison. I am writing this now after in 2021, there are a whole bunch of people stormed the Senate and House of Representatives, the U.S. Capitol, which is federal property. And I am thinking that folks, many of whom were calling, I shouldn't say many, at least some were calling for violence. And those folks are going to be tracked down. And if they do end up in prison, they will be in a federal prison, be my guess, because it's a federal crime on federal property, because the FBI are the ones chasing them down. They could also be eligible for a state crime if you think of Washington, D.C. as a state, a local crime, right? Like if you were out after curfew because the mayor put a curfew ban, right? Then you would go to, pretend D.C. is a state, now we know it's not, but you would go to a state prison, if you will, in D.C. for that, right? So violate a federal law, you go to a federal prison. That's the one in Hawaii by the airport. If you go to violate a state law, you went to the most serious prison, that would be Halawa in Halawa Valley. Okay, so that's just a little explanation of what goes on in terms of the two states. Excuse me, the two prison systems. All right, that's the end.